Excellent. I think we might be able to kick off. For those that don't know me, I'm Danielle Wood. I'm president of the Economic Society. I'm joining today from Boomerang Country, and I would like to pay my respect, excuse me, to the traditional owners of this land and all the lands from which people are dialing in today. This is the first of two events that the Economic Society is hosting as part of Social Sciences Week. That is the week we get to celebrate and contemplate the social sciences and their contribution to Australian life. I would really encourage you all to visit the Social Sciences Week website. There is a huge, really interesting, diverse set of events that are free to participate in throughout the week. But to kick this one off today, we have our fantastic moderator, Madeleine Morris. Madeleine is ABC's News Breakfast Finance presenter. She has a special talent for making economics and finance engaging at 6 o'clock in the morning. In her 2 decades as a journalist, she's reported from more than 20 countries, and for 12 years was a reporter, producer and presenter for the BBC based in London. Thank you very much for joining us today, Madeleine, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Danny. It's lovely to be here joining you from my lounge room. I'm going to leave you all to ponder this piece of art behind me. This is not where I was supposed to be, but unlike the majority of the rest of you, I have actually been going into the studio every day since the pandemic began. So most of you would have a fear of going on television. I have a fear of going on Zoom because I am completely incompetent at it, as proven by the fact that I've had to come out of the office and into the kitchen. So let's hope that my new puppy doesn't disturb this too much. But my new puppy will never be able to afford to own a house in Australia either at this current rate. But we're talking today about what is one of the key issues for housing for this country, which is housing affordability, and the fact that so many people now find housing just completely out of reach. And I was reflecting on it as a news reporter and finance presenter. Actually, I probably don't talk about it enough. And the reason that I probably don't talk about it enough is because it's not news. It's become one of those staples of Australian society that housing just goes up and up and up. And for increasing slabs of our society, housing is now just going to be out of reach. I actually got a pitch this morning from a PR for finder.com, which is a comparison site. And I read it and I had to call the PR up immediately because I just thought there has got to be a typo in here. It just seemed so incredible. But there wasn't. And ahead of the RBA's meeting today, they've put out some findings showing that the average mortgage repayment in Sydney now is $4,512 a month. The average after-tax monthly income is $5,955. And for all of you economists out there, you'd have already done the maths, but that is an income to mortgage ratio repayments of 76%. That's in Sydney. The lowest capital city was Perth at 35%. Now, of course, that's average, and there are a whole bunch of things that go into it. But nonetheless, that is, I think, tells a story about where we are. And before I introduced our panelists today, I just wanted to throw just one more figure that really stunned me actually in researching this. And although our rate of home ownership has been pretty stable since the 1960s, at around 67-70%, the data for age groups has really changed. So in the start of the 70s, the home ownership rate of 30 to 34-year-olds was 64. It's now 50%. And I work with a lot of millennials, and the weekends the Mondays that they trudge into the office, having just been blown out of the water again by investors and 50 other people putting up their hands at auctions, is really quite very dispiriting, I think. So it's one of the biggest issues that really faces us as a country. And we've got 3 top economists ready to tackle it today. We're going to solve it all in an hour. That's what we're going to do here. But let me just introduce them because and throw it over to them because they're the brains in the room. So we're going to be talking about the question of housing affordability. tackling a couple of things. How did we get here? What is the impact of it, and what policy settings could particularly change? We're going to have a presentation of about 5 minutes from each of our panelists. Then I'll ask some questions and then we'll throw it open. So I can already see someone has put a question. Thanks, Wayne, in the Q&A box. Get your questions in early because there will be a lot at the end and we won't have time to go through them all. So Saul, I've already got a question for you. I'm going to hang on until I introduce you. So let me, without any further ado, introduce the speakers. So Brenan is with us today, Brenan Coates. He's the Economic Policy Program Director at Grattan, where he leads the work on tax and transfer system reform, retirement incomes and superannuation. He's worked with the World Bank in Indonesia and in Latin America, and also for Australian Treasury. Nicki Hutley, of course, needs no introduction. She's an economist of some 30 years standing. She's worked in the corporate world for many, many years, including as a partner for Deloitte before starting her own independent practice. And she has a strong focus on social impact of economics, including for women and for climate. Nicki, give us a wave. Hello. And Brenan, I should have got you to give a wave as well. Hello. And then also a man needing no introduction is Saul Eslake. He is an independent consulting economist with extensive experience in the corporate world and for government, including as the chief economist for ANZ and chief ANZ economist at Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. He also was a member of the Rudd Gillard government's National Housing Supply Council. And he's coming to us from a lake somewhere in Tasmania today, Saul, is that right?
Not a lake, actually. I'm coming from Hobart, but the thing you can see behind me is in the far northwest of Tasmania at a place called Marrawar, where my parents lived for 25 years. And if the world was flat, if you looked out in that direction, you could see Argentina, but only on a clear day, which doesn't happen very often up there.
Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to have all of you. So, Brenan, I think we'll kick off with you today. So I think that you wanted to have a small presentation about the causes of what is driving this ridiculous increase in housing prices, and to think about and to just sort of give us the lay of the land in terms of where we're at in housing affordability in Australia.
Thanks, Madeleine, and thanks to the ESA for the opportunity to talk today on what is such an important topic, particularly for younger generations. I thought, as you flagged, Madeleine, I've got a couple of slides just to talk through, which I think it's worth just setting the baseline. It is Social Sciences Week. We are economists, so it's worth just talking very briefly about the economics of housing. When we say housing affordability, when we talk about the fact, is housing the great Australian dream out of the reach of today's young, we are referring to home ownership. And that is obviously just one of the ways that people can access housing. And so in the limited time I've got, I want to talk just very briefly through about what that actually means and how housing affordability, when you think about it as home ownership, has changed over time. So, Social Sciences Week, we're going to start with a little bit of economics, which is there's two distinct ideas here. There's the idea of living in a house and the idea of owning a house. Now, to live in housing is something that we would both live in. So it's something we consume, but it's also an asset that we own. And so when we think of living in a house, we're really paying rent is the price of living in a house. It's the price of housing services. Now, rents are determined broadly by the balance of demand and supply in the stock of housing. So demand is population, income, and other things, and the stock of housing that's supplied. And so, house prices don't tend to affect rents. Instead, rents affect house prices. And rents are really not affected much by interest rates, only indirectly if lower interest rates drive more housing construction. And so that's the idea of living in a house. But most people in Australia consume their housing quite differently. They're owners. And if you think about owning a house, then house price is the cost of owning an asset, which gives you the right to live in it. And so house prices depend upon both current and expected future rents, interest rates, expected capital growth, how much it's going to depreciate, so what's it cost you to maintain the place, and running costs, including taxes. And given what's happened in the last 18 months, this last point, borrowing costs, is really what's driving a lot of what's going on, because you buy a house, 5, 6, 7, increasingly 10, 12 times your annual income is what you're borrowing or purchasing for. And then you've got to pay that back gradually over 30 years. So borrowing costs matter enormously to house prices. And so that's what we've seen in the last year. If you had said to a lot of people 18 months ago, we're going to have the biggest recession, in living memory, and house prices are going to rise by 20% across most of the major capital cities, a lot of people didn't think this would happen, but underlying the economics of it is a really plausible and sound explanation, which is you've got to borrow to buy a house, and the cost of borrowing matters a lot. And we've seen that interest rates in Australia have hit record lows. And as you get closer to zero, as that cash rate gets closer to zero, then the borrowing rates that people are borrowing at get closer to zero. So you can get a standard variable rate mortgage for 2.5% today. And so if you cut interest rates from 3.5% to 2.5%, that's a huge change in someone's purchasing power. It's a huge change in someone's borrowing capacity in a lot of cases. And in fact, if you look back, the Reserve Bank's own research suggests this is exactly what would happen with the scenario that's played out. So a paper by Peter Tulip and Trent Saunders in 2019 basically said if you cut rates by 1 percentage point from where we are, and that's seen as being a permanent decline in interest rates, then house prices rise by 28% in the long run. If it was a temporary cut in interest rates, then house prices rise by, say, 10%. And what we've seen looks somewhere between those two levels. So how has this affected affordability? Well, there's three main constraints when you think of housing affordability. First is, can you save the deposit? Now, lower rates don't make it easy to save the deposit, they make it harder. And what we're really worried here is a growing gap between those with and without the bank of mum and dad. Because if you have a deposit and interest rates are lower, you can buy more, you can go further than you otherwise could. And as someone we're looking to upgrade our house, we found that the value of our own house has gone up so much that we're actually looking at a larger house than we otherwise would because the equity's gone up. The second question, though, is can you afford to service the mortgage repayments? And in this instance, lower rates in a lot of cases actually make that easier. Lower rates mean you can borrow more and be confident if rates stay low that you'll be able to service those repayments for a long time. And that's what we've seen. Borrowing costs, so mortgage interest repayments as a share of total household income, have actually down at the sort of lows that we saw through the 80s and 90s. Now, interestingly enough, when we worried about interest rates being 17%, total mortgage repayments as a share of income across the economy, it wasn't that high. And it's because house prices were low, right? So when a house was only 2 times your annual income, you didn't worry. It wasn't such a problem. It was obviously challenging at the time, but in context, Australians were through the 2000s spending much more of their income on housing, on servicing a mortgage than they were in the 1990s. But of course, you've got to pay back that loan over 30 years. And some past work that we've done suggests that, one of the effects of buying it with higher repayment, with higher house prices, is you've got to pay back that loan, including the principal, over a longer period of time. So even in a world where you've got lower rates, it's not necessarily clear that housing is going to cost you less of your lifetime income. Now, this story of lower rates causing the deposit hurdle being worse, causing serviceability to be less, basically has the effect of, for some people, housing is more affordable and some people it's less. And the big problem here is the difference, frankly, between those that have access to the Bank of Mum and Dad and those that don't. So the Bank of Mum and Dad is now Australia's 5th largest mortgage lender. Something like 30% of parents are assisting their children to buy a house. And so the real problem, as Madeleine put it at the outset, if you're thinking about who is being deprived access to home ownership, to the great Australian dream, it is younger people, but it's not all younger people. It is younger people who are in the poorest 40% of income earners of that age cohort. Home ownership is crashed. 35 years ago, home ownership was basically level across those groups. Now, it really does go up with a gradient. So it's the poorest 40% of each age cohort that are struggling to buy a house. And you can see that flowing through into older age cohorts where home ownership amongst 40 to 50-year-olds is falling sharply. And this, I think, is the challenge that we face. It's not a problem of home ownership falling across all cohorts. It's an intergenerational story, but really it's an intragenerational story. At the end of the day, we are worried about the poorest 40% of Australians no longer accessing home ownership. And we've built our society on the premise that they would. And therefore, we've got some tough times ahead in trying to reconcile the great Australian dream and that expectation with the reality we now see on the ground. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think it's over to me now. I'm not sure if Mads is frozen, but I'll launch in. Thank you and good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to everyone from Camaragal country in Sydney. Thanks for that, Brenan. A great introduction around what's driving the problem. And I think, you know, as Madeleine said earlier, this is not news. This is something that's been going on for a long time. Politicians, though, have just failed us over and over again in terms of having a consistent, coherent, long-term strategy for dealing with housing affordability. And it probably lies mostly with state governments and even local governments to do something. In fact, Gladys Berejiklian, when she came to the leadership, had housing affordability as one of her premier's priorities. She has quite a number of those. But really, other than a small bit of research saying that land prices were the problem, something I was involved in, you know, nothing has really been done to change the situation. And I wanted to perhaps flip this a little bit from, you know, what's the problem in terms of just affording a house, to thinking about what lack of affordability means for the broader economy and for individuals, so that broader social impact. And I think, just to be clear also, to talk about housing affordability as a broad concept is, you know, how many of us, you know, that last chart that Brenan put up about, you know, intergenerational as well as intragenerational inequity, you know, across income groups within an age cohort, is slightly different from the prospect of affordable housing, which is what the government provides or supports through the non-profit sector for those who can't get into the mainstream market. And there's always going to be a cohort that fall into that category. And so we need to think about policies that are about the broader market and the level of overall affordability, as well as how do we provide housing for those who, even in a far more reasonable market, are not going to be able to access it. And on top of that, there's one more concept which I would talk about, which is appropriate housing. And this is the idea that you don't just have a roof over your head, it needs to be appropriate to your needs. So if you're somebody with a disability, for example, you need a house that embodies universal design so that you've got proper access throughout. And in fact, you know, some people would argue that at some stage in our life, pretty well all of us are going to need that universal design in the form of wider corridors or doorways or access that doesn't involve steps, because it might be, you know, you break a limb for a while, or you know, my mum's just had a knee reconstruction and getting up and down the stairs is pretty fraught for her. When you have kids and you've got to bring prams in and out. You know, thinking about what's appropriate, thinking about overcrowding in housing, particularly a problem for First Nations Australians. You know, it's not just about a house. It needs to be an appropriate house as part of the equation. But some of the things that I wanted to highlight were just the consequences, because when government policy works, it looks at what is the size of the problem, what are the costs associated with the problem, and then what are the benefits of dealing with the problem, the costs of treating the problem and the benefits of doing it. And so if we can think about it in those terms, then maybe we might get some more policy happening. And so just thinking about you know, some work that I did a couple of years ago for Indigenous Business Australia, and this obviously had a First Nations focus, but we surveyed some 7,000 people who were involved, who were given a grant for home ownership, a very subsidised grant. And we got over 1,000 people responding, which was absolutely terrific. And some of the things that came out of that were improvements in safety. So when people have secure housing, they tend to feel more safe. And that actually helps their individual capacity to deal with other things. It improves your self-esteem. And this is not just home ownership. You know, this is about having secure, affordable housing, whether it's rental or ownership. You know, we don't all have to necessarily own, but we do have to be able to have secure rental housing if ownership is outside of our reach. Health is another one of the outcomes, both physical and mental, particularly if you have overcrowding, if you have poorly serviced, particularly in rental accommodation where you've got leaky taps. Again, particularly in Indigenous, but also in lower income households, we see significant health problems because houses they have leaky taps, or they have, you know, they're drafty, and you see health consequences come from that, physical health consequences. You have mental health, of course, which can lead to anxiety, even depression, increases in emergency department admissions, not just from a mental health basis, but from increased asthma because conditions aren't right. Educational outcomes are also, fall by the wayside. When you don't have secure housing, people, rental laws in Australia tend to favour the owners rather than the tenants. If you're having to move constantly, that can be incredibly disruptive to your kids' schooling. But it's also been found in the research that if you don't provide sort of the right environment for kids to learn, where they've got some quiet space, some alone space to do their learning, and making sure that you've got proper lighting and heating, then that's going to affect childhood learning outcomes, which affects lifetime income outcomes, flows on consequences not only to the individual but to society in the form of lower tax revenues. So this flows right through to everyone. Community engagement, crime, family functioning, all of these things have been shown to be dependent on having stable housing outcomes. And this is why many not-for-profits who are looking at treatments for whether it's drug and alcohol, domestic family violence, a whole range of outcomes, the housing first model is the one that's now put forward to make sure that people have that secure housing to allow them to then get better outcomes from the other problems that they're dealing with. And of course, employment's another one. And this one, the research is a little bit mixed. We tend to assume that if you've got stable housing, that you're more likely to get a job. And some of the research suggests that is the case. Having an address that you can put down is obviously pretty important if you're going to try and find a job, and all those other things I talked about, like self-confidence, self-esteem, those help you to find employment. But there's also other research that suggests that it's somewhat circular. And so if you don't have a job, then you find it harder to get housing and you end up in this vicious cycle, unfortunately. So you then, of course, have those that are actually end up in homelessness because of lack of affordability. And we all know that the statistic that women over 55 are the fastest rising group of homeless because of the costs, and particularly if you don't have enough superannuation built up. Anyone without enough superannuation built up is going to be in strife in retirement, but particularly women over 55 seem to be falling into that group a lot more quickly. And some research done a while ago by Ahuri, one of the leading housing research institutes, came up with a figure of close to $15,000 a year just for health and justice costs associated with homelessness. And they found that basically if you provided social housing, that you got a return on investment of 2.7 times. So it was well worth the expenditure. SGS Economics did another study in 2017. They came up with around $10,000 a year. And again, a similar story of, the return on investment of investing in affordable housing in public housing is well and truly worth it to support, dealing with all of these other outcomes. So my proposition today is, we know this is a problem, but it's a problem that we actually have to deal with. And we can't just think about it in isolated terms of they're the winners and losers, because every policy decision has winners and losers. And yes, if you put a lid on housing prices, those who own assets, housing assets, stand to lose, but there's a whole other generation that stands to gain. And balancing those two up is a very difficult act, not one that any governments wanted to take on. And so trying to balance those two things, as I said, getting the supply up, getting housing to at least stabilise, would be a first step. And clearly, when you think about all those adverse social outcomes from not dealing with the problem, it's one that really it's inexcusable that we keep just ignoring it. And I'll hand over to Saul now.
Well, thank you, Nicki, and thank you, Madeleine, for the introduction, and do say hello to my cousin Thomas Ariti when you see him tomorrow morning on News Breakfast. It's always a problem when you're batting third that the good points have been made by the speakers who have come before you. So let me just try and shed some light on the issue from a slightly different perspective. People probably don't remember, I suspect I'm the eldest person on this panel, that between 1947 and 1966, Australia's population grew at a faster rate than it has done in the last 25 years. And in particular, the populations of our 5 biggest cities grew at a faster rate than they have done in the past 25 years, because there was a much bigger movement of people from regional areas of the country than into the capital cities than there has been since. And indeed, that's sort of gone into reverse a bit, maybe temporarily during COVID, but in effect, the population of Australia's biggest capital cities increased by 53% between the censuses of 1947 and 1966. And yet the amazing thing is that the ratio of house prices to incomes, as far as we can measure them from the limited data for that period available, was stable at about 3. And the home ownership rate rose by 20 percentage points, from 52 to 72%. And the reason why Australia was able to achieve that quite remarkable outcome is because governments during that period, federal, state and local, Labor and Liberal, focused on boosting the supply of housing, either by building it directly themselves, which in the 1950s, they built about 1 in every 5 houses that were built during that period. And yes, they were often poorly built and in locations remote from employment and other forms of infrastructure, and they often weren't adequately supplied with some of the other things that help to make houses homes, but at least they provided people with somewhere secure to live, and thus to start to enjoy some of the other benefits of secure housing that Nicki referred to. The rot set in my view, beginning in 1963, when the then president of the New South Wales Young Liberals, whose name was John Howard, persuaded Sir Robert Menzies, who was the Prime Minister, to offer at the 1963 election the first home savings grant. And from that moment onwards, it's been downhill all the way in terms of housing policy at all levels, from governments of both political persuasions. Policy has gradually shifted away from a focus on boosting supply to a focus on inflating demand, and particularly at the state and local level, restraining supply. So whenever there has looked like being a downturn in housing activity or in house prices, the response of governments on multiple occasions, including during COVID, has been to offer ever larger grants to would-be first home buyers on ever looser eligibility criteria. And the result has always been to inflate housing prices further. In fact, I've argued for 40 years that these things should be called second home vendors grants, because that's where the money ends up, rather than first home owners grants, or if they are restricted, as some state schemes have been, to people who buy established housing, people who buy new housing, then they should be called builders and land developers profit margin enhancement grants, because that's where the money ends up. In addition, since Keating's reintroduction of negative gearing in 1987, and especially with the change to the capital gains tax regime in 1999, tax policy has served to inflate demand to the point where something like 15% of individual tax-paying Australians are landlords. And although it's harder to be negatively geared at current interest rates than it used to be, 11% or thereabouts of Australian taxpayers are negatively geared, and Australia has gone from having one of the highest rates of individual home ownership in the world in the mid-1960s now to having one of the highest rates of individual landlordship, if that's the right word, in the world. And in effect, as you can see from data on housing finance, would-be first home buyers have been squeezed out of the housing market by a combination of cashed up migrants and domestic investors. In the early 1990s, when the housing finance figures started, about 40% of all mortgage lending went to first home buyers and about 11% went to investors. At the peak in 2015, those figures had almost completely flipped over, that over 45% of lending was going to investors and about 11%, less than that in New South Wales, was going to would-be first home buyers. First home buyers had what John Howard would have called 5 minutes of sunshine last year, when, as a result of extraordinarily generous grants and hesitation on the part of investors, given that the chief economists of all the banks were saying that house prices would drop by double-digit amounts, they piled into the market, inflated the price of housing, as they always do when they get cash grants like this. And for a brief moment, they got up to 28% of the supply of housing finance. But now that investors have started to pile into the market, reassured by the Labor Party having gone to water on the policies that they took to the 2016 and 2019 elections, that their tax privileges will stay for as long as they plan to buy a house, that they're now squeezing would-be first home buyers out of the market again. And the problems that first home buyers face are directly related to the problems that people at the bottom end of the income distribution face with regard to affordable rental housing. Because as a result of the decline in home ownership among people in their, say, mid-20s to mid-40s, which is now as low as it's been at the time of the 1947 census, there's a cohort of people who can no longer afford to buy a home, which they would have done in previous generations, but they're sufficiently affluent to be able to rent readily in the private market, and they've pushed up rents to the detriment of the people who, both in previous generations and now, would never have expected to have owned their own home. And because since the 1980s, state governments of all political persuasions have cut back on increasing the supply of social housing, we now have significant proportions of people who in generations gone by would have got by in social housing, now not being able to get into social housing and suffering enormous rental stress in the housing market, stress not only in terms of spending a high proportion of their income on rent, but also having particularly insecure housing tenure, which, as Nicki said, makes it harder for them to, for example, provide employment or to provide stable schooling for their children if they have to keep moving all the time. And, you know, the sad thing is that politicians spend a lot of time shedding crocodile tears over the difficulties that young people have getting into home ownership. But the reason they keep doing the same thing, inflating demand and constraining supply through draconian planning laws and zoning restrictions and the like, the reason they keep doing that, well, let me put it differently. You sort of have to ask yourself, why do governments keep doing things which history shows unequivocally produce the opposite outcome to what they say they intend? You know, as I think Sherlock Holmes said in one of the Conan Doyle stories, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The reality is that politicians know that in any given year, there is typically 100,000 people who succeed in becoming home buyers for the first time. Those 100,000 people would like governments to do things that stop house prices going up. At least they would until the moment they succeed in becoming home buyers. When they do, they join the 11 million people who already own at least one house, to say nothing of the 2 million people who own 2 or more properties. And the last thing those 11 million people, and especially the 2 million who own more than one house, want governments to do is anything that would stop house prices from going up at a faster rate than incomes. And so you've got, 11 million people who want house prices to keep going up, maybe 100,000 people who'd rather government didn't do that. Even the dumbest of our politicians, and I'm not talking about a small group here, even the dumbest of our politicians can do that math, and they do it every day. So, I despair that we will ever solve the housing problems that we have, because the majority of Australians don't want that problem to be solved.
Saul, thank you so much. I'm going to jump in because we've only got 25 minutes left until the session is due to end. And you've all opened with such incredible and bang on points from very different perspectives. We've also got so many excellent questions which are already coming in, which I want to get to as well. I just wanted to, this issue of housing supply is clearly central to the whole shebang. That's part of the issue. Saul, I would disagree with you actually that 11 million people want house prices to go up. I'm a homeowner, well, I'm a mortgage owner. I need a bigger house, and I would get a lovely price for my current house, but I can't afford to get the next house up. And so,
and I can't even say to you, follow Sabra Lane and move to Tasmania because they're
Exactly.
so expensive. They're so expensive here.
Exactly right. So, I wouldn't just put all of the 11 million homeowners in the same basket saying that, we're all very happy, because that's not the case. Just a couple of things. I want to start, first of all, with something which you alluded to, Saul, which is immigration. Now, we actually are having this incredible phenomenon in Australia now of net negative migration, which is something that we haven't had for decades. Brendan, if I can just ask to you, very simply, why is it if we've got fewer people coming into the country, and that's been one of the things that has pushed prices up, why are prices going down? How is this not feeding into the complex matrix that you've explained, particularly to do with the interest rates as they currently are?
Thanks, Madeleine. Well, compared to a world where inflation was still coming in at 200,000 plus people a year, rents are lower than they otherwise would be. The trouble is that rents maybe fall 1-2% as a result of that lower rate of migration. So demand and supply for housing is determined at the level of the stock. And we only add 200,000 people a year to Australia, and we add maybe 100,000. So we add 400,000 people a year to Australia, and we maybe add 200,000 homes. So if you cut off migration for 1 year, you've only changed the demand for housing by a very small amount. The Reserve Bank has done some work that suggested, if we hadn't have had that migration boom post 2005, migration had continued at the levels it had been, rents would probably be 9% lower. So, migration clearly does affect house prices and rents, but it is relatively small, particularly a single year of lower migration, compared to the effect that interest rates have had on house prices over the course of the last couple of years.
Nicki, I'm not going to ask Saul because he said that he despaired already. So I want to move it to someone who's not quite despairing. But how do you think that we get governments of all stripes to actually care about the supply issue in a meaningful way, and to put that on the agenda?
Governments tend to only care about things that they think will win or lose them elections. And as long as we as citizens are prepared to just whinge about this as we sit around the tables, doesn't matter how many academic papers we write or cost-benefit analysis we do, they get ignored until people power rises up and makes this an election issue. And it really needs to be at the state government level. There's only so much the federal government can do. Until we put pressure on our politicians, I actually can't see this changing because, as we've said, with the winners and the losers, it's really hard to balance that out. And politicians are taking the bet that those that stand to lose, as we saw when the federal Labor suggested removing negative gearing and capital gains tax, which would have some positive impact on housing prices for a period of time at least. We saw particularly older generations get quite irate about that concept, and we're really pitting one Australian against another. So until I would say to millennials, Gen Zs, whatever you're called now, you have to be much more vocal. You have to make it count. Unfortunately, we're also going through so many other issues, whether it's gender equality or I sit on the Climate Council, so climate is obviously one of the things that millennials are probably even more worried about. There's so many challenges that we face collectively. I think it's hard, and as long as politicians think they can get away with it, they will just do nothing, unfortunately.
Because it's just so hard. There's an excellent, I'm going to go to questions because we've got many, many of them, and I want to get to them. Bruce Bradbury poses a really great question. I think, whenever I talk, we're waiting for the RBA decision today, which is not going to be to change interest rates, which is going to be around bond buying, whether to taper that or not. It always becomes a decision, a conversation about house prices, about the cash rate, but that is not within the purview of the the Reserve Bank of Australia. And Bruce Bradbury says, should the RBA have asset prices, especially housing, as a target? If so, should it use other instruments such as the maximum length of mortgages? We've already had someone reply. Matt Calgill says, in my opinion, no, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have asset prices as a target. What do you think, Saul?
Well, I agree with Matt that the Reserve Bank shouldn't be targeting house prices. I mean, it hasn't been able to achieve its inflation target for the last 5 years, so why should it be able to achieve a house price target, even if it had one? But, you know, while, as Brenan said, lower interest rates have contributed to the inflation of house prices all around the world, incidentally, not just in Australia, as someone else observed in the chat box. You know, that's not the only factor that's involved. And, you know, I disagree respectfully with Nicki on this point that there's not much the federal government can do. The federal government can stop inflating the demand for housing. Right? I mean, yes, state governments have in various ways and local governments have constrained the supply of housing, and they ought to stop doing that. But it's the federal government that has inflated the demand for housing, in particular by giving first-time owner grants on the scale they do every time house prices take a dip, and through their tax policies. And I don't think it's correct to say that the Labor Party's tax policies on negative gearing and capital gains tax cost them the 2019 election. I mean, they almost won the 2016 election with those policies, and they only lost the 2019 election by one more seat than they didn't win it in 2016. I suspect it was more the policies on dividend imputation that cost them votes, especially among older generations, than on negative gearing. And, you know, what's perhaps worth noting is that the New Zealand Labor Party has gone much further in the direction of cutting negative gearing and imposing capital gains tax on property investment than the Australian Labor Party had ever proposed doing. And you know what? The sky has not fallen in New Zealand in the way that the property interests always say when anyone ever talks about getting rid of negative gearing in Australia. They talk about what allegedly happened in 1985 when it was temporarily abolished. What should be happening, though, to go back to the specific question, is that APRA should be doing something about the degrading of lending standards. You know, interest rates aren't the only tool that's available to influence mortgage lending. There's also the macro-prudential controls that APRA did impose for a while in the early part of the past decade. New Zealand has done that too. And I think APRA is asleep at the wheel in the face of what has been a significant increase in lending at LVRs of 80% or higher, some of which can be explained by the increase last year in the proportion of loans that are going to first-home buyers, but by no means all of it. There's also been a significant increase in mortgages written at LVRs of more than 90%, and APRA is doing nothing. They're asleep at the wheel, and they need a wake-up call.
So I'm going to interrupt you there because I could see Nicki shaking her head when you said that you didn't think that it was the negative gearing policy that cost Labor. I mean, that's certainly been the accepted wisdom amongst Labor, so much so that they've now abandoned that policy to the next. So we now have no major party taking to the next election, which will be before May, any policy to change capital gains or negative gearing. Nicki, would you still like to see this be a policy of at least one major party to see a change to the system of negative gearing? And what difference would that make to affordable housing affordability in Australia?
Yeah, no, Saul, I wasn't saying it was the single issue that cost them the election, but certainly they got a lot of negative press, especially from the more conservative media over that, and a lot of the property sector didn't like it either. It would, you know, our modelling showed, that I was involved in some time ago, that it possibly can reduce prices around about 5% if you lifted those, using the Labor Party's policy of removing the benefits and grandfathering them. So look, every little bit helps, and I'm all for it. It would be great to see governments with bold policies across a whole range of different portfolios to say this is what the nation needs and to lead on that front. And you're right, of course, Saul, you know, the grants thing, it goes without saying, and that's done by state and federal governments as well. I guess I just come back to say that whilst there are things the federal government can do, I still think there's far more that rests with state governments, particularly on the supply side. And obviously federal governments can also assist by land grants, for example. That's something that they could quite easily do. So maybe I'll temper what I said about them not being able to do that much. There are things they can do, but I do think, that there's a lot of responsibility. We often tend to say, what's the federal government going to do, without thinking about what's the role of state and local governments in say, planning, that I think is also very important. But we have to have policies, but apparently we don't. So no one's got the courage to do it.
And the trickiest thing of all, getting federal, state and local to all work together, Nicki, which is the holy grail, which is,
Well, we couldn't even get New South Wales to work with local governments over the planning white policy paper not that many years ago. So one does tend to be a little bit despairing, but I don't want to leave our younger viewers today without the thought that, that this can be changed, and that, they shouldn't ever remain silent on this issue. You've got to keep advocating for change.
So when you were speaking earlier, you put a lot of blame on the federal government for inflating house prices, encouraging people because of all of the different grants that they give to people to be able to buy homes. And there's quite a list: home purchase assistance, first homer grant scheme, Indigenous home ownership program, first home super saver scheme, which we'll come to in a little bit,
Yep.
First home loan deposit scheme, the family home guarantee, the home builder scheme as well. So you're right, there is a huge amount of money which is thrown at this. But Brendan, I have a question for you, which has been a recurring theme in some of the questions that we've received. It's about the Australian culture. And there's certainly a perception that in Australia we are obsessed with owning our own home. Timo Henkel in the chat compares that with Europe, where he says European tenants have a lot more rights, and people look down their nose less at you if you say that you're a renter. But actually, do we have a cultural issue with this in Australia? Because if you look at comparisons at between the OECD and Australia, we're not up there in terms of our home ownership. I mean, I'd always thought that we were top of the tree, but actually we're not. And I just wonder culturally, just from you, Brendan, as the person who's probably closest to buying your home for the first place, for the first time, if you think that there is a cultural aspect to this.
Thanks, Madeleine. So you're right that home ownership in Australia is not particularly high by global standards. We're kind of middle of the pack. I think what is different about Australia is to the extent that which we've embedded the assumption of home ownership in, quite a lot of aspects of our political and social life. So the really obvious one is, within our retirement income system with the age pension, we really punish renters. So, if you have $500,000 sitting in home equity and housing, you can get the full age pension. If you've got that same $500,000 sitting in super or in other assets, then you won't get the full age pension. And that's where this inequity is going to play out really clearly over the next few years as home ownership rates, fall amongst younger and poor and lower income cohorts, because today's 30 and 40-year-olds become tomorrow's 50, 60 and 70-year-olds. So we probably use the home more as a form of insurance than a lot of other countries. The other part of it, though, is that our rental market is, fairly unique in largely being made up of mum and dad investors. I don't love the term, but it is sort of well established, which is to say that most of our rental stock is owned by households themselves. In a lot of countries, in Europe and elsewhere, the rental stock is owned by the government or by institutions. And one of the benefits of that is that you get a better quality rental stock. You tend to have less of a tension in tenancy law, because if you're a mum and dad investor with one house that's worth this huge share of your total savings, you're terrified that you'll get a bad tenant, and you'll discriminate against anyone that looks like they might be a bad tenant, and you'll be at loggerheads in the court when we debate questions of tenancy law reform. If that was owned by investors, as it is elsewhere, then those issues probably are less of a problem, because if you own 1,000 units in Trump Tower, and one of them, that one of them's going to go bad, but the other 999, you're going to get the rent from those and you can hedge your risks. So I think the way we've set up our society, relying upon home ownership to provide that insurance to basically treat people very unequally in the pension system, and the fact that renting is, not a great deal often in Australia because of that structural problem, means that, you know, we're probably more vulnerable to a fall in home ownership than many other countries.
It's interesting to contrast what you just said there with about what Nicki said earlier about people needing to get angry and younger people needing to stand up and make this an issue electorally. It's you can't really see people going out with a picket saying, make the family home part of the pension assets test now. It's just not going to happen, is it? I mean, there are so many things which are much easier, I think, and equally valid to protest about. I just, so, you know, from an angry society point of view, that's not going to move the needle. Nicki, on what is going to move the needle, and what just speaking about what Brenan was just talking about there, Vanessa has asked a question saying, what changes could be made to make renting more attractive, and to changes to how society is built? And that, I suppose, that does go to that broader cultural question too, which Timo was asking earlier.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in rental law, but I do understand that compared to, you know, particularly European markets where it's much more investor owned, the rights, even in the US, the rights sit in Australia much more with the owner rather than with the tenant. So I often relate a story when I was quite young and pregnant with our first child, and we were living down in Melbourne, and I came home one afternoon and there was a for sale sign on our rental home, which you can imagine, no warning, no nothing, you know, and these are the types of stories. And you just hear endlessly the stories of people who are bumped out of their homes, that you can't own pets. And we know, like, that might sound a bit frivolous, but we know that pets can actually be really good for people's mental health. You know, you can't hang this on the wall, you can't make the place permanent. And that's the permanency aspect. It's that you can be thrown out at any point in time, that you often don't get a response from the owner if you say this isn't working. It might take ages to do. Whereas if you have an investment property or group of investors investing across a whole block of units, you have a super in the building that's looking after all of these things, those problems go away. So I think, you know, as Brendan says, maybe it's about the ownership structure, because I don't know how we change that where we've got individual, you know, tenants, landowners that are running the show and obviously looking out only for themselves. But there is no reason why government, who puts these regulations in place, cannot change the regulations to make them fairer. And again, it comes down to who are the winners and who are the losers, and who do they think is going to punish them for making them the losers rather than the winners in an election. And it's a rotten way of making decisions, because you often end up without having the best, you know, policy. It's the politics rather than the economics or good policy that wins out, sadly.
I've got a question for you, Saul. This is the #1 question that's been voted up by most people in the chat, and it comes from Jared Kiss. He says, who's 18? He says, for a younger person such as myself who's 18, how can we prepare ourselves for owning a home in the near future with such high prices?
Yeah, and the only answer I can give is to choose your parents carefully, which is sort of echoing what Brendan.
That's not an answer, Saul. Come on.
Well, I agree. I mean, but, you know, to pick up sort of something I think you alluded to in your commentary, Madeleine, I'm surprised there isn't more anger among young people about the way in which their parents' generation has rigged the housing market against them. You know, why there aren't more people, you know, chanting, what do we want cheaper housing, when do we want it like now, as people of that generation probably would. And I think instead of doing that, they're taking their revenge out on their parents' generation by refusing to move out of their homes and, you know, expecting their clothes washed and their meals cooked and a blind eye turned to whoever is accompanying them at breakfast the following morning. And, you know, it may be until, you know, all the houses that baby boomers were hoping to sell and go touring around Australia, which of course you can't do now without getting a passport across state borders and that sort of thing, you know, until, you know, the houses that baby boomers are sitting in have got multiple generations living in them, because you know, the kids and the grandkids can't afford to live in homes of their own. Nothing's going to change, because, you know, the political calculus is, as I described it at the beginning, that there are, and as Nicki has described it, there's a lot more votes in policies that keep house prices going up than there are in policies that might restrain them. And the same calculus is behind the lack of attention to social housing as well, too. I mean, another thing the federal government could do is to put more money into social housing, and they could attach conditions to the grants they make to the states to encourage them to do more on the supply side with regard to housing, which, to be fair, I think the Morrison government did, or the Turnbull government did 2 or 3 budgets ago. But they won't do it because the assumption is that social housing is predominantly located in safe Labor electorates. And so both the Labor Party know they won't get any more votes by putting more money into seats that they already win, and the Liberal Party knows they won't get any votes by putting money in seats that will never vote for them. So nothing happens. And apologies for the cynicism, but in 40 plus years of observing and trying to understand what politicians do, I've never found that cynicism leads me to incorrect conclusions.
Can I just jump in there though and say that one thing you should consider is that house prices have gone up significantly further than unit prices have in the last couple of years. And I'm just having a look at a chart in front of me, and it's a fairly substantial, probably 10 percentage point difference over the last couple of years. So, and there's also where you are. So there's a big difference between different states and between capital cities and regions. And obviously you can't just go and live in the middle of nowhere where it might be quite cheap to put up a tiny house, but because you will need employment. But one of the good things, if there's such a good thing that can come out of COVID, is that we are more flexible about where we live and where we work. And that should actually help a little bit of the market dynamics so that you're not having everybody wanting to be exactly close to the train line or the bus stop. Maybe we've got a little bit more flexibility, and that might help to smooth the demand, because it's not just the aggregate demand, it's demand in those locations where people most want to live, where they've got the amenity, the transport, the hospitals, the shops, the whatever else. So, you can get your toe in the door. And a lot of young Australians have done that over the last decade, is to actually buy rental properties in places where they would never live, to get their foot in the door of the property market.
Although conversely, Nicki, we are now seeing, because of that whole tree change, sea change phenomenon, which we've seen so much over the past 18 months, we're now seeing regional house prices rising at a higher rate than capital city house prices, which is certainly linked to the working from home phenomenon. We are nearly out of time.
That's right, Madeleine, down here. Yeah. I mean, it costs more to buy a house in Hobart than it does in Brisbane, Adelaide or Perth. Cities that are 5 to 10 times as big as us, and it costs more to rent a house in Hobart than it does in Melbourne, which is a city 25 times the population.
It's an absolute crisis. It's an absolute crisis in Tasmania. You're 100% right, Saul. We are just about to run out of time, but there was one really good question that I wanted to end on before I throw back to Danny. That's from Cameron Murray. I'm going to throw it to you, Brendan. He says, globally, dwelling asset prices are very high. Are there housing policy experiments elsewhere that have been successful that we could learn from? It's quite, if you don't know the answer, that's fine, but just in case there was a specific answer that you had.
I think there are things that other countries are doing that we should think about. So, one of those things, my view is, in the long run, you are probably looking at trying to make housing more affordable, in part by boosting supply. Now, there's a question about how you do that with the planning system. There are also questions about how you do that if the government goes and builds more housing. One of the more interesting models that does exist is what exists in Singapore, which is essentially the government offers people the ability to buy a house, often at discounted rates. But the thing there is that they own all the land. So the closest market to doing this in Australia is probably ACT, where the government is a monopoly provider of land for new residential development. But the real problem here is a lot of the really innovative solutions that have worked elsewhere, like Singapore, they're hard to implement in Australia because the government does not own the land. And so if it's going to offer that kind of benefit to people, it has to acquire it from somewhere. And that's a pretty difficult thing to do when house price appreciation has already occurred and you've given up that appreciation in land values. It's the same with a lot of proposals that say Australia should build 20% of the housing stock as social housing. It's just incredibly expensive. And so, in a world where you could go back with a time machine back to 1945 and offer those kind of proposals, I think you should. The challenge is we're in the world that we're in, and that probably means at the margin making housing more affordable by fixing the planning system. eking out changes in the tax system, as hard as they may be, as we've discussed today on negative gearing and elsewhere, and making residential tenancy more attractive by fixing the tenancy law system. And I think they are the best chances we've got to make housing more affordable and secure and providing that access to all Australians. But look, it's a tough slog. It's not an easy thing to do. There's no one silver bullet that's going to do it.
Thank you very much, Brenan. That was a very concise answer to a really big question. Thank you. Look, Danielle is with us. We are just out of time, and I know that you'll all probably have meetings starting at 1 o'clock. So I'll hand you back to Danielle, and just I'd like to say a big thanks to Saul, Brenan, and to Nicki for a really interesting discussion. One thing that I will say about being a financial journalist, or a journalist who covers finance in Australia, is that we're incredibly blessed in the breadth and experience and generosity of our economists in this country and sharing their expertise with us, and we all benefit from that. So thanks very much, and Danielle, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Madeleine. I'd like to join you in thanking the panel. I thought it was a fantastic discussion. It feels a shame to stop it short, and thanks to you, Madeleine, for moderating. If that's given you a taste for economists discussing important issues, please do come to the other event we're hosting this week, which is on women's economic wellbeing in older age. I think Di's put a link to that one in the chat, or you can go to the Social Sciences Week website and look at the other events on offer. Di has also put up a link to becoming a member of the Economic Society. Really encourage you to sign up if you're not a member. You do get access to lots of great events, an opportunity to engage with others with an interest in economics, but you do also support our work in advocating for the profession. So, you know, that's everything from protesting ARC rule changes on preprints, that will mean something to the academics in the audience, as well as trying to kind of boost the size and diversity of the economics pipeline. So we are a group of volunteers. We rely on memberships to keep doing what we're doing. So please visit the website and sign up. Thank you all for attending, and have a fantastic afternoon.